So the first part of the spinal cord is the cervical part, which again is giving rise to cervical spinal nerves. And if we look in the region of the cervical part of the spinal cord, you can see this kind of enlarged portion right here called the cervical enlargement. And it's thicker there because that part of the spinal cord has the somas of motor neurons that go out and control the muscles in your arms. So the cervical enlargement is part of the cervical part of the spinal cord, and it's enlarged there due to these extra somas for the motor neurons. So we'll say it contains the cervical enlargement with somas for motor neurons for the arm. And then if we look inferior to the cervical part of the spinal cord, we have the thoracic part of the spinal cord, which gives rise to our thoracic spinal nerves. Then inferior to that, we have this little lumbar part. The lumbar region is pretty short, and this is like the end of spinal cord proper. And from that region, we'll have the lumbar nerves branch down and form part of that cauda equina. And the lumbar part has a lumbar enlargement that contains the somas for our motor neurons that are serving the legs. And then again, the lumbar part of the spinal cord is pretty short, and that ends our spinal cord proper. And it's going to come down into this region. The coda medullaris is like the very end of spinal cord proper. And then all of these lumbar spinal nerves and sacral spinal nerves, and there's one coccygeospinal nerve, are all going to be part of this cauda equina, which is just like this stringy thing that's got these, the lumbar nerves and sacral nerves kind of coming out of it. So that's the gross anatomy of the spinal cord from superior to inferior. If we look at what does it look like in a lateral or a cross-sectional view, then we can see that in the spinal cord, our white matter is superficial to our gray matter, which is opposite of how it was in the brain. So our white matter in the spinal cord has ascending and descending tracts of myelinated neurons that are going to bring information up to the brain and down from the brain. This gray matter here has this either whole inner neurons in it or the cell bodies of our motor neurons that are then going to be branching out and going in our spinal nerves to bring information out to the periphery. So as far as cross-sectional anatomy goes, what do you have to be aware of? That we've got white matter that contains our myelinated axons that are going to and from the brain. And this is superficial to our gray matter. And again, these are myelinated axons that are bringing information to and from the brain. then that deep gray matter contains either whole interneurons that again are a link between our sensory neurons and our motor neurons, or the somas of our motor neurons. Yes, you have a question?
I can't remember, what is the pia matter and neuroactin matter and all that?
We didn't really get a chance to talk about it a whole lot. It's just layers of the meninges, which are the protective layers that surround the brain and spinal cord. So in your dorsal cavity, those organs, the soft tissue, is protected from the bone by meninges, which are different layers of connective tissue.
Gotcha.
In the ventral cavity, all of our organs are protected by serous membranes, so we'll talk about those more next semester. But so this is showing you the different layers of meninges, but again, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it because we just have too much to go over.
Okay. So we don't even know about the different types?
No, don't worry about the meninges. So, and then our gray matter is whole interneurons, or the somas of our motor neurons. Or I should say, and the somas of our motor neurons. So our spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. But it kind of helps to understand what's going on in the spinal cord if we look at the composition of spinal nerves right now. So if the spinal cord is deep in the vertebral canal or column, and then arising from it, we've got our spinal nerves. If you remember when we talked about nerves, when we were talking about cranial nerves, we said there were three types of nerves. Sensory nerves that have only sensory neurons, motor nerves that have only motor neurons, or mixed nerves that have both. In the cranial nerves, we can have all three types. All of our spinal nerves are mixed nerves. So every single spinal nerve contains sensory and motor information. And we can tell, looking outside of the spinal cord, which information is which, looking at this thing called the dorsal root ganglion here. So this is our spinal cord again, and then coming out of it we have this dorsal root, or a posterior root, and that has all of our sensory neurons. And what we said about our sensory neurons, most of our sensory neurons that are bringing our general somatic sensory information from the body are unipolar. So here are their somas found in this dorsal root ganglion. This is what makes this region enlarged, is that it contains all of these cell bodies. Then from those somas, we get this one branch that comes off of the soma and then quickly splits into what's called a peripheral process and a central process. The peripheral process goes out and senses what's happening in a receptor. The central process comes in and synapses on an interneuron in the spinal cord. That interneuron then is going to synapse on a motor neuron and be able to, like in the case of a spinal reflex, you can conduct a spinal reflex without going up to the central nervous or to the brain. Some of these sensory neurons can go all the way up to the brain or to the medulla oblongata, but we'll talk about that in the next chapter. So if we look at what's happening in the spinal cord, this posterior gray matter has our somas of our interneurons, and then this anterior gray matter has the somas of our motor neurons. So if we look then at the spinal nerve, in the anterior portion, we have all of our motor neurons coming out. So just outside the spinal cord, you would be able to split and say, okay, this dorsal root has sensory information, this ventral root has motor information. Both of those roots come together to form a mixed spinal nerve. So again, we'll talk about the spinal nerves in more detail in a little bit, but this is what's kind of giving rise to this gray matter here, is the synapses of those sensory neurons on our interneurons, and then those interneurons turn around and synapse on the bodies or the somas of our motor neurons. So, any questions? Okay. So as far as neuronal pathways go, there are some characteristics that are common to all of our neuronal pathways. And the first is that all of our pathways decussate. Decussate means cross over to the contralateral side. So the contralateral side is the opposite side. So at some point or another, our sensory pathways are going to cross over on the way up to the brain, and our motor pathways will cross over on the way down from the brain. So decussation is the first thing that our sensory pathways have in common, and that just means that our pathways are crossing over at some point. So decussation means that our neural pathways are crossing over to the contralateral side. Contralateral means opposite. This is what gives rise to that property of the brain, like the left hemisphere sensing and controlling the right side of your body, and the right hemisphere sensing and controlling the left side of your body. That occurs because of decussation in a neural pathway. Another thing that our neuronal pathways have in common is that they are kind of like relay pathways. So the information is coming in or coming out using 2 to 3 neurons. So it's not just one neuron that brings information about temperature from your finger into your spinal cord and up to your brain. It's a pathway of 3 nerves that brings it up, and then we've got motor pathways that use 2 nerves to bring information back down. So we can say that all of our neuronal pathways have relay, and that they use 2 or 3 neurons to bring information to and from the brain. Okay, another thing that our neuronal pathways have in common or characteristic is that they have symmetry. So every pathway on the right side has a matching pathway on the left side. Okay, so our neuronal pathways are going to be bringing information to and from the brain through the spinal cord. So we have ascending and descending tracts. Tracts, we said, are these groups of axons in the central nervous system. Groups of axons in the peripheral nervous system are nerves. So our tracts are carrying information along our axons to and from the brain. Our ascending tracts are the sensory tracts that are bringing sensory information up to the brain. So ascending tracts carry sensory information to the brain. And in an ascending tract, for most of our general sensory information like touch, pressure, pain, that's going to use 3 neurons. The sensory information that's going to your cerebrum only uses 2, your cerebellum only uses 2, but we're not going to talk about that just because we don't have enough time. This is like spinal cord light. So for our most of the rest of our information, we use 3 neurons. So that would be like pain, temperature, pressure, vibration. All of those things are going to use 3 neurons. And our first order neuron is going to be the neuron that is in contact with a receptor. And this is a sensory neuron. It's unipolar. And it's in contact with a sensory receptor. So its peripheral process goes out and touches a sensory receptor, and synapses on an inner neuron, either in the medulla oblongata or the spinal cord. So there are two pathways that sensory information can follow up to the brain that are going to involve these different sensory neurons. So again, I'm not going to make you worry about the specific receptors and things, we just don't have time. But in general, we can say that this first order neuron, in some cases, it comes into the spinal cord. So this would be our peripheral receptor out here that's sensing something like light touch. And this is going to come into the spinal cord, and in some cases, they ascend all the way to the medulla oblongata before they synapse on a secondary neuron. So this would be like our spinal cord at the level of processing, and it's going to come all the way up to the medulla oblongata before it synapses onto its inner neuron. In other cases, our primary or our first order neuron is going to synapse right on an inner neuron in the spinal cord at that level, and then the inner neuron decussates and crosses over. So one or the other will happen with this first order neuron. So they can be really long axons that are going all the way up to the medulla before they synapse, and then we have decussation in the medulla. So we have one or the other, but I'm not going to make you worry about the different pathways. Just be aware that there are two types of first order neurons. Either they have short central processes that are synapsing onto an inner neuron that decussates, or they've got long central processes that go all the way to the medulla before it decussates. All right, so our second order neuron then is going to be what this primary or this first order neuron is synapsing onto. So, and it's going to be a multipolar inner neuron. And it again is going to either be in the medulla oblongata and then decussate and go up to the thalamus, or it will be in the spinal cord and decussate and go up to the thalamus. So it's a multipolar inner neuron, and it's either in spinal cord or medulla oblongata. We'll say it's soma. And it synapses in the thalamus. Why does it synapse in the thalamus? Because the thalamus is the sensory relay station. So now the thalamus is going to have our third order neuron. And this again will be a multipolar bistructural class. And it's an inner neuron because it's wholly contained in the nervous system, the central nervous system. And it is going to have its soma in the thalamus. And it's going to synapse in the primary somatosensory cortex for our general senses that are following these ascending tracts. So descending tracts are going to be bringing information down from the primary motor cortex to be executed out through effectors in the body. And our descending tracts in general have two neurons. We only ever name two. There may actually be an inner neuron between our upper motor neuron and our lower motor neuron, but we don't really name it. So a descending tract is going to bring motor commands out to the periphery. And so this will be of our in our somatic nervous system. It will just use these two neurons. When we look at our autonomic nervous system, we'll look at the difference between how the two systems work. So these bring motor commands from the central nerve, or from the brain. And we use two neurons, an upper motor neuron, which begins, its soma is found in the precentral gyrus, or the primary motor cortex. And it's going to synapse, it may synapse onto an interneuron, but we don't name it. But it will definitely at some point either synapse on an interneuron, and that interneuron will synapse onto a lower motor neuron, or it will synapse directly onto a lower motor neuron. And the lower motor neuron is going to innervate a skeletal muscle and always be excitatory. So we can say that the upper motor neuron synapses in the spinal cord. So our lower motor neuron, its soma, is in the spinal cord. And it synapses on a skeletal muscle. So this would be our peripheral somatic nervous system is going to work this way. Our peripheral autonomic nervous system uses a chain of two neurons down here, so it's slightly different. When we come back from our break, we'll look at the difference between the way our motor neurons come out for our autonomic nervous system. Okay, so this is showing our where you can find these tracts. I'm not going to test you on this, it's just kind of for your own information. So your ascending tracts are bringing the information up to your brain. And so you'll find the axons in these different regions of the spinal cord. And then your descending tracts are bringing information down from the brain. And we find their axons in these other regions of the spinal cord. And again, we've got different tracts that are responsible for different types of sensory information, but we just don't have time to talk about it. All right, so that's the spinal cord. That ends the central nervous system. Now if we look out to the peripheral nervous system, then there are different things that we need to be aware of. We've talked a little bit about sensory receptors. We've at least defined nerves. We're not really going to talk about motor endings and activity, but we are going to talk about reflex activity. So these are just different considerations in the peripheral nervous system. And we're going to talk at least about 3 of the 4 of them. So we'll start by talking about receptors. Receptors are modified nervous tissue that are responding to different types of sensory input. And so for our peripheral nervous system, so that spinal cord is all part of the central nervous system. Our peripheral nervous system has 2 branches. The sensory branch, which is bringing in sensory information that is conducted back to the central nervous system, and then the efferent or motor division, which brings out commands. And again, this has 2 branches. The somatic division that you have control over, so it's the only effectors are the skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk about this when we get back from break, and this has 2 divisions that we'll spend more time talking about. As just a first general consideration for the peripheral nervous system, we have different types of sensory receptors. So our receptors are responding to changes in stimuli, and we can classify them based on the stimulus type they're responding to, where we find them, and how complex they are. So receptors respond to stimuli. And if we classify them based on the type of stimulus that they are hooked up to, then we have these 5 different classes. Our first are mechanoreceptors. And these respond to physical perturbation. So this would be like light touch versus deep touch versus pressure versus vibration. So these respond to physical perturbation. So examples would be light, touch, deep pressure, vibration.
What's the word on it? I can't see the glare.
Perturbation. I don't know why they got rid of our lines here, because it is quite annoying. Let's get a glare. Thermoreceptors are the second type by stimulus type, and they respond to changes in temperature. So we've got two types of thermoreceptors, cold and hot receptors.
What's that word after light touch?
Deep pressure. Light touch, deep pressure, vibration, those would all be examples of mechanoreceptors. Our thermoreceptors respond to changes in temperature. So we have both cold and hot. Our hot receptors respond to temperatures above body temperature. Cold receptors respond to temperatures below body temperature. Photoreceptors are only found in the eye, and they respond to different wavelengths of light. So they're kind of sensitive to the electromagnetic scale. Photoreceptors are found only in the eye. Chemoreceptors are sensitive to chemicals, and so they are sensing or responding to different levels of chemicals suspended in fluid. So like your smell receptors are chemoreceptors. So in order to smell something, that odorant molecule has to be trapped in the mucus in your nose, and then it'll stimulate a chemoreceptor. Your taste buds are also chemoreceptors. So you have to taste the particular molecule that you're tasting has to be suspended in saliva, and then it can be picked up by a chemoreceptor. So these respond to chemicals suspended in fluid. Both of those examples of chemoreceptors that I just gave you are chemoreceptors that you're aware of. So that would be bringing in somatic sensory information. But you also have chemoreceptors throughout your hollow organs that can respond to like level of pH. So you've got chemoreceptors in certain places in your great arteries and in your hypothalamus that are paying attention to blood pH. You've got chemoreceptors throughout your GI tract that are paying attention to the pH of the material passing through your gastrointestinal tract. So chemoreceptors don't have to always be somatic, bringing in somatic sensory information. It may be visceral sensory information that's below your conscious awareness. And then our last type of receptor is this receptor called a nociceptor, and a nociceptor detects pain. And pain is a sign of tissue damage. So we'll say our nociceptors respond to pain. And generally when you activate a nociceptor, you're also activating some other kind of receptor. So if you pinch yourself really, really hard, you're going to be first activating mechanoreceptors, but then as soon as you start hitting tissue damage level, you'll activate a nociceptor. If you burn yourself, you'll first activate a thermoreceptor. I mean, unless it's like you stick your hand on a really very hot surface. Then at the same time you would activate your thermoreceptor and your nociceptor. But in general, you activate one of these other receptors first, and then when you start getting to a level of tissue damage, you'll activate a nociceptor. And that will trigger an involuntary reflex to move you away from the painful stimulus. So all of something that I didn't mention, but I should mention about our receptors is that they all adapt pretty quickly. So like if you were to put a quarter on your hand, at first you'd feel it. After about 5 minutes, you stop feeling it. Same thing with like you hop in a hot tub. At first it's really hot, but then eventually you adapt. Nociceptors eventually adapt. They take a while, so they take longer than our other receptors to adapt, but they will eventually adapt. We can also classify our receptors by their location. So if we classify a receptor by location, we say our exteroceptors are responding to changes in the external environment. So this would be like your temperature receptors in your skin, or your chemoreceptors in your nose. So our exteroreceptors are responding to changes in the external environment. Where your interoceptors are responding to changes in the internal environment. So this would be like those chemoreceptors in your gut. Those are interoceptors. Also, we have other types of receptors called baroreceptors that are responding to levels of stretch. So if your blood vessels dilate, they feel that. That's an interoreceptor. It's responding to a change in your internal environment.
What was the example you just gave of that?
A baroreceptor, which detects levels of stretch of like your blood vessels or of your hollow organs. Those are mechanoreceptors by type of stimulus because it's a physical perturbation, but it's an interoreceptor by location because it's responding to an internal change. So your blood vessel dilates, a baroreceptor feels that. Your blood vessel constricts, a baroreceptor feels that. So it's an interoreceptor. And we'll talk about baroreceptors next semester. And then the third type by location are proprioceptors. And these are found in your joints and your muscles. And these are what's communicating that information up to your cerebellum to tell you about your place in space. So then the last way we can classify our receptors is based on their complexity. And for our general senses, all of our receptors are pretty simple. For our special senses, we've got complex sense organs. Simple receptors, these are going to be come in two forms, what are called encapsulated and non-encapsulated. And again, all of our simple receptors are bringing in information about our general senses. So we'll say that they respond to general senses. And we've got two classes of simple receptors, what are called non-encapsulated. And this means that they do not have a nice, organized connective tissue covering. So we'll say they lack connective tissue cover. And examples of non-encapsulated sensory receptors would be what we call free nerve endings. And free nerve endings is just literally like it sounds. It's a nerve ending that's out there in the periphery that has nothing around it. It's going to be directly hooked up to a sensory neuron. And so we can find them as exteroreceptors, interoreceptors, and proprioceptors. If we look at what they are by sensory modality, then they typically are our thermoreceptors, our chemoreceptors, some deep pressure receptors, or some of our pressure receptors, and our nociceptors. So our free nerve endings just, again, are totally free receptive segments that are responding to changes in temperature or changes in chemical concentration. Not all of our mechanoreceptors are free nerve endings, but for some types of pressure and then for pain. I'm not going to write this stuff down because you guys can read it in your book, but we will just talk about it. And then we have these other things called tactile discs. We met these tactile cells when we talked about the integument. In the stratum basale, we said there are these cells, these Merkel cells, that respond to light pressure. They are hooked up to an unencapsulated receptor called a Merkel disc. So this is going to be able to bring information about this light touch back along a sensory neuron. So they're only found as exteroreceptors, and they're mechanoreceptors that are sensitive to light, very light pressure. And then the last type of unencapsulated or non-encapsulated nerve ending we have is this hair root plexus, or what your book is calling a hair follicle receptor. And these are again attached to the bulb of a hair and are going to respond like if there's movement of the hair. So a bug lands on you or something. So it again is an exteroreceptor, and it's a mechanoreceptor, and it's the perturbation it's sensitive to is movement of your hair.
Those are all non-encapsulated.
Yep, those are our 3 examples of non-encapsulated. So we're responding to things like temperature changes, pain, pressure, very light touch, or movement of a hair. Then we have encapsulated receptors, and our encapsulated receptors have some kind of connective tissue covering on the ends of them. So there are lots of different types of encapsulated receptors. So we'll just talk about them really quickly. We have these what are called tactile corpuscles, and you can see that around the end of this receptive segment here, they've got this connective tissue sheath that covers them. They're exteroreceptors that are pressure sensitive, so they're mechanoreceptors. And I'm not going to ask you about the specific different types, but you can just be aware that it's like light touch, discriminative touch, vibration, or low frequency. Those are all going to stimulate our tactile corpuscles. Then we have these lamellar corpuscles, which have these kind of larger regions of connective tissue around the end. These can be found as exteroreceptors, interoreceptors, or proprioceptors. They're mechanoreceptors that respond to deeper levels of pressure, stretch, and high-frequency vibration. We also have these things called bulbous corpuscles that are exteroreceptors and proprioceptors. And so they're also, by sensory modality, they are mechanoreceptors that are sensitive to levels of deep pressure and stretch. We have these specialized receptors called muscle spindles. We'll talk about these when we talk about reflexes. Muscle spindles are found in your muscles, so for location, they're proprioceptors, and they are responding to levels of stretch in a muscle. So as the length changes in your muscle, that's what they're sensitive to. And when we talk about our different reflexes, we'll talk more about them. Our tendon organs are these specialized proprioceptors that are found in your tendons, and what they're responding to is the level of stretch in a tendon or the level of tension building in a muscle. So both of these are going to be responsive for reflexes. Reflexes are protective. So if you experience too much stretch in a muscle, you'll activate a muscle spindle and you'll make that muscle contract without thinking about it. If you build too much tension in a muscle, if you're giving it too much work and you start pulling on that tendon too much, you're going to activate a tendon organ. So you'll activate a spinal reflex that will cause you to drop the load. So both of those are going to be responsive to levels of stretch in either the muscle or the tendon, and they're going to be protective for our reflexes. And then we also have what are called joint kinesthetic receptors. These are proprioceptors that are both mechanoreceptors and nociceptors in your joints, and that's just going to communicate information about location of your joints, what position your joints are in, or if you're in pain. Okay, I think we're almost done with this chapter. So, well, just about ready to take a break. Again, other than simple receptors, we can have these complex sense organs, but we don't have time to talk about our special senses right now, so we won't worry about our sense organs, our complex receptors. As far as sensory processing goes, just be aware that sensation and perception are two different things. So sensation is the actual awareness of changes in the environment, and there can be conscious awareness or subconscious awareness. Like your hypothalamus is aware of the pH of your blood, but you're not really aware of that. So that's going to be different than perception, which is how you interpret the stimuli that are coming in from your sensations. So we'll say sensation is the conscious or unconscious awareness of some change in a stimulus, or subconscious or subconscious, I should say. So sensation, again, is the conscious or subconscious awareness of changes in the environment. And then perception is your conscious awareness of those stimuli. So the only thing that you really have perception of are all of your somatic senses. So things coming in like temperature changes from your skin, or pressure changes on your skin or something like that. Versus like a chemoreceptor that's detecting pH of your blood or pH of the material passing through your GI tract. That is producing a sensation, but you're not aware of it. So your perception of the things like your visceral information is that you don't have perception of. And if you don't have complete neural pathways leading up to the part of your brain that's responsible for perceiving a certain stimulus, you won't have perception of it. So we'll talk about that when we talk about nerves. As far as our structure of nerves go, just be aware they're organized just like our muscles were, where our axons of our neurons are grouped together in fascicles that are covered by our perineurum groups them together as fascicles, and then we get fascicles grouped together in a nerve covered by epineurium. I'm not going to test you on that again. It's the same arrangement as our muscle was. They're electrically insulated from each other by areolar connective tissue called endoneurium, and then they're gathered together in fascicles that are covered by our dense irregular connective tissue called perineurium. Our fascicles are gathered together by dense irregular connective tissue called epineurium. As far as our nerves go, we've already talked about this when we talked about our cranial nerves, that we classify them based on the type of information they're carrying. If they only carry sensory neurons, they're sensory nerves. If they only carry motor neurons, they're motor nerves. All of our spinal nerves are mixed nerves. I'm not going to test you on the cranial nerves again because you were tested on that for your last test. So our cranial nerves would be the example where we see all three types of classification. In our spinal nerves, all of our spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They carry both motor information and sensory information. Any questions so far? Okay, so for our spinal nerves, we're just going to quickly talk about them and then how they gather together in nerve plexuses. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that arise from the spinal cord. We've got the 8 cervical nerves that are arising from the cervical part of your spinal cord. And so you may be thinking, well, there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. Why do we have 8 cervical nerves? And that's because C1 comes out above the atlas, and all of the rest of them come out below their vertebra. So you have one above and below C1, and then all of the rest of them come out below the cervical vertebra that they are kind of located near. So for your cervical nerves, they are C1 through C8. And if you remember when we talked about our vertebrae, we labeled them C1 through C7. So the difference between a vertebra and a nerve can be seen in the location of its number. If it's a big number next to the letter, you're talking about a vertebra. If it's a little number below the letter, you're talking about a nerve. So we've got 8 cervical nerves, and these are going to serve like the very lower parts of your neck and the upper parts of your shoulder and very superior aspects of your arm. Then our thoracic nerves are T1 through T12. They arise from the thoracic part of your spinal cord. Then we've got lumbar nerves, L1 through L5. Again, they are going to come out of that conus medullaris region and kind of branch down in that cauda equina. Then we have sacral nerves, S1 through S5. And there's one little coccygeal nerve that's C sub 0. So if we look, our cervical nerves are going to come out of the cervical part of the spinal cord. Again, the atlas has one above and below it. All of the rest are below the vertebrae. And they're going to come out and branch into this nerve plexus we'll talk about in a second. Then our thoracic nerves, T1 through T12, located here in the thoracic region. Our lumbar nerves, our sacral nerves, and our one little coccygeal nerve. So again, our spinal nerves carry both motor and sensory information. So coming from the spinal cord, we've got this dorsal root that carries the sensory information. So we could say a spinal nerve is where our dorsal and our ventral roots come together. And the dorsal root is going to contain our sensory neurons, and the ventral root contains our motor neurons. So our spinal nerves are mixed. And from the spinal cord, our dorsal root contains sensory information. And our ventral root contains motor information. Both of our roots are going to come together to form the spinal nerve. So our dorsal root, again, you can tell anterior from posterior on the spinal cord because the dorsal root has this enlarged region where it's got all of those somas of our sensory neurons. Our ventral root has our motor information. They come together and form a spinal nerve. So if you have spinal damage, damage to your spinal cord, depending on whether you've damaged both roots will determine your level of impairment. So I've been a CNA for like 14 years now, and I have a patient who's quadriplegic, and she has full spinal cord damage at the level of C7. So she can't feel and she can't move, but it's at C7, so she has a little bit of control of the muscles in her shoulder. She's got a friend who is quadriplegic, but he only has damage to his ventral root. So he can feel everything, but he cannot move. Which just, if you think about it, that's got to be a pretty miserable state of being. Because if you're sitting and you can't move for 8 hours a day, then you feel all of that pressure. And because he doesn't have damage to that sensory root, the information makes it in and makes it up. So he can feel it, he just can't do anything to move. So this again is where perception, we said, is all in your head. If you can't get the information through and up, then you aren't aware of it. You're still having all of that sensation happen. So there's still pressure, there's still pain, there's still temperature changes out there in the periphery. So the sensation is occurring, but your perception of it is gone because you've disrupted the pathway that brings it up to your cerebral cortex. Does that kind of make sense? So perception is literally all in your head. All right. As far as just be aware that we have these things called nerve plexes, and this is where we have different spinal nerves come together to serve different parts of the body. So I'm not going to test you on the specific nerves that are found in the plexus, but I might ask you, what does the cervical plexus serve? And the cervical plexus is going to serve your anterior shoulders and the upper part, your superior shoulders and the upper part of your arm. So a plexus is this group where different branches of our spinal nerves come together to serve a specific body region. So your cervical plexus is going to serve your neck and your head and the superior part of your shoulders. So don't worry about which nerves are making up your cervical plexus, but know that we have a cervical plexus. And a plexus, again, is this kind of merging, grouping together of our spinal nerves, and it serves your head, neck, and shoulders.
Is the cervical plexus a nerve? A spinal nerve?
It's all of these, it's branches of C1 through C5 that kind of come together. So we just don't have whole lot of time to talk about all of this stuff, which is kind of why I blew over it. But if you look outside your spinal nerve, you can see that we'll start having branches that come to the front and come to the back. So when those branches meet up, they meet up in a plexus. And the cervical plexus is going to be these branches of these nerves that are meeting up and serving your head and your neck and the superior aspect of your shoulders. Your next plexus is your brachial plexus. So it also is coming from branches from some of our cervical nerves and our T1. Again, I'm not going to make you worry about which ones are coming together, but these branch again in these complex branching patterns and come together to form what we call this brachial plexus. The brachial plexus serves your arm. For your lower limb, so your cervical plexus is going to serve the more superior structures. The brachial plexus is found right here, and it's going to give rise to all of the nerves that serve your arm. Then we've got a lumbar plexus and a sacral plexus that are arising to serve your lower limb. So your lumbar plexus is arising out of your lumbar spine, and it's serving muscles in your anterior thigh and leg. So more kind of like superficial muscles and anterior muscles. And then our last plexus is the sacral plexus, which gives rise to the largest nerve in the body, the sciatic nerve. And the sacral plexus serves your posterior and deeper muscles. And our sacral plexus has the sciatic nerve running in it. And the sciatic nerve is the largest nerve in your body, and it runs all the way to your foot. So reflex arcs are these sensory to motor pathways that protect you from some kind of damage. So they don't require conscious input to get some motor response happening, because we need to get you away from what's going on so that you don't damage your tissue. So reflex arcs are protective. And we can say, so driving is actually a learned reflex, which isn't protective, but things like your patellar tendon reflex, that's protective. It's protecting you from levels of stretch. When you touch something hot and you pull away from it, that's a reflex arc. It's not going all the way up to your cerebrum to initiate that motor control. The motor control is happening all through your spine. So our reflex arcs are protective. They, in general, will always react to the same level. So when you hit your patellar tendon, you should always kick to the same degree. So, and they're not really like your protective reflex arcs you're born with, so we would say they're innate and they protect you. So you're born with them and they protect you. And for every reflex arc, we've got 5 components. And we're going to talk about visceral reflexes after our break, and they also have 5 components. So the first component is going to be our receptor that's detecting some damaging or painful stimulus. So this detects a change. It's going to communicate this information along a sensory neuron. So we'll say is responding to the receptor. It's going to bring this information to what's called an integration center, which takes the information and decides what to do about it. Then we have a motor neuron that's going to carry out the desires of this integration center by stimulating an effector, which brings about the change. So we'll say it, how do I want to phrase this? So our integration center is going to tell the motor neuron what to do. So it will stimulate our effector. And our effector is going to bring about change. To move us away from whatever this receptor is detecting. Okay, so what are some examples of reflexes? So, well, okay, before we go into specifics, we can say we have some stimulus out here that's going to be picked up by a receptor. The receptor communicates that information along a sensory neuron. Sensory neuron brings it to an integration center. In the case of our reflex arcs that we're not thinking about, this is an inner neuron. So that inner neuron is going to respond and stimulate a motor neuron, which is then going to carry out our change by stimulating an effector. So the different types of reflexes that we have, stretch and tendon reflexes are going to be responding in the body to, in the case of a stretch reflex, dangerous levels of stretch in a muscle. In the case of a tendon reflex, it's responding to dangerous levels of tension in a muscle. So for a stretch reflex, the stimulus is dangerous levels of stretch. In a tendon reflex, the stimulus is dangerous levels of tension. I guess I should say dangerous levels of stretch of the muscle. For our tendon, it's dangerous levels of tension, which is going to stretch the tendon. So some of those proprioceptors that we talked about are the muscle spindle and the tendon organ, and these are going to activate stretch and tendon receptor reflexes. So a muscle spindle is the receptor that's responding to dangerous levels of stretch. So this is detected by a muscle spindle. Our tendon organ, also known as the Golgi tendon organ, is going to respond or is going to be detecting this dangerous level of tension in the tendon. So let's say detected by a tendon organ. This patellar tendon reflex is going to stimulate a stretch reflex. So what we're hitting is the patellar tendon, and we're artificially making it think that we've stretched this quadriceps femoris too much. So if you stretch a muscle too much, then you're lengthening it too much. So how you combat that is by contracting it. So in a Golgi tendon, or in the patellar tendon reflex, what's happening is we're stimulating this tendon to make it kind of fake it out and make it think that the quadriceps femoris is stretching too much. So if we're stretching too much, then we need to initiate contraction to kind of combat that. So the sensor is going to be we're hitting the tendon organ, which is causing the muscle spindle to fire. That's going to communicate it along this sensory neuron that is attached to our quadriceps femoris. The sensory neuron comes back and it's going to synapse directly on a motor neuron that causes contraction of the quadriceps. And then it's going to synapse on an inner neuron that's going to synapse on a motor neuron that inhibits your hamstrings. Now if you think about that, if we're contracting our quadriceps femoris, we want to make sure that these muscles relax so that we don't have damage to this tissue while we're contracting this. We call that reciprocal inhibition. So in the case of this stretch reflex, what you're doing is basically what you're doing is you're acting as though that there's increased stretch in the quadriceps. So this is going to stimulate a sensory neuron that brings the information back and does a couple things. It's going to directly synapse on a motor neuron. And our protective effect is going to be to cause contraction of the quadriceps. So this motor neuron will contract quadriceps. Then it's going to synapse on an inner neuron that synapses onto another motor neuron. And this motor neuron is going to relax the hamstrings. We call this reciprocal inhibition. So the receptor is the muscle spindle. The sensory neuron is the sensory neuron. The integration center is this inner neuron. And then our motor neurons, we've got two motor neurons. One that's going to stimulate contraction of the quadriceps to protect it from this dangerous stretch, and one that's going to inhibit the hamstrings via reciprocal inhibition to make sure that the hamstrings aren't combating this contraction of the quadriceps. Does that make sense? Kinda. Can you see all the components of the reflex arc? So the stretch in our quadriceps is detected by a muscle spindle. It stimulates a sensory neuron. That sensory neuron is going to synapse directly on a motor neuron that moves you away or contracts that quadriceps. And then the other one is going to synapse on our inner neuron, which then is acting as the integration center. So it's taking the information and deciding what to do. In this case, we need to cause reciprocal inhibition of the hamstrings. So it stimulates a motor neuron to relax the hamstrings to make sure that they are not contracting while we're having our quadriceps contract. Antagonist, so we need to relax the antagonist.
Is this some way of to test these fours or 3 steps?
You need to know the 5 components of a reflex arc, and yes, I would know be able to come up with an example of a stretch reflex, and this is the example that we're going over, so it's probably a good one to study. Okay. So a tendon reflex, again, is going to be responding to dangerous levels of tension. So now, in this case, if our quadriceps are building up too much tension, so they're contracting too much, then we need to relax them. So in order to do that, the tendon organ feels this contraction, because if you think about it, the tendon is attached to this muscle. As this muscle is shortening, it's going to stretch that tendon. So as it stretches that tendon, the tendon organ feels that, sends the information along the sensory neuron. In this case now, our integration center are going to be these 2 different inner neurons. One is going to synapse onto a motor neuron that stimulates relaxation of the quadriceps, and one is going to synapse onto an inner neuron one inner neuron is going to synapse onto a motor neuron that stimulates contraction of the hamstrings. So that now we're inhibiting this, and we're reciprocally activating this, so that if there was too much contraction here, we relax it, and if we're going to relax the hamstring, or the quadriceps, then we're going to contract the hamstrings. So I would review that as well. I'm not going to write all of the steps down for this one, because it's in your book. So just be aware of how these 2 reflexes are working. And then the last type of reflex is what's called the flexor. Well, these are actually 2. So we've got a flexor reflex and a cross extensor reflex. And these work together at the same time. So, and these will move you away from painful or damaging stimuli. So in this example, it's showing us what would happen if somebody grabs you unexpectedly. I like the example of the leg better than the example in the arm. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But if somebody grabs you unexpectedly, the reflex reaction is going to be to pull away. So a stranger just grabs you, like try and take your watch or something, your response is going to be to pull away. That's a flexor reflex. And so when you've got some kind of damaging or painful stimulus applied, then that will initiate flexion of the muscle to pull away from it. So we'll stimulate our flexor by carrying the sensory information along the sensory neuron. It's going to synapse on an inner neuron, and then our inner neuron will synapse on a motor neuron that stimulates our flexors. Again, we have reciprocal inhibition of the extensors. The crossed extensor reflex is attached to this. So the flexor reflex is one part of it. Pulling away from it is one part of it. But what tends to happen is the sensory neuron is synapsing onto an inner neuron that has multiple branches, and one of them is going to cross over and cause what we call crossed extension reflex. And again, in the arm it doesn't make so much sense because you're not usually used to feeling this. But in general, what would happen if you were just totally not paying any real attention and you were to have a flexor reflex, then when you flex your left arm, you extend your right arm. And that happens because this inner neuron will stimulate your extensors to contract, and you extend that arm and you inhibit the flexors. So again, it doesn't quite make so much sense in the arm, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about it in the leg. So if instead our stimulus is that you step on a tack with your left foot, then that's going to stimulate nociceptors that stimulate that sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is going to synapse on an inner neuron that causes you to pull away. So you would stimulate your flexors in your leg and flex your left leg to move away from it. Well, now we really have to make sure that we extend that right leg because it's got to bear our weight. If we don't activate the crossed extensor reflex, then you would fall over. And so if you have this flexor reflex engaged in the left leg, then always in the right leg you'll have the extensor reflex, where you contract those extensors so that your body can maintain your weight, despite the fact that you're coming off of it.